A black janitor's hands trembled as he cradled the wailing infant found abandoned in the darkest corner of the mansion's east wing. The entire household stood frozen in disbelief when the baby's true identity was finally revealed. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. John Smith had worked at the Harrington estate for 5 years, blending into the marble corridors and polished silence. His presence was as familiar as the antique furniture, yet somehow just as overlooked. The 62-year-old janitor moved through the mansion with practiced efficiency, his worn hands knowing every corner that needed attention. He was known for his gentle smile, his slow gait, and the way he hummed old spirituals as he cleaned the halls. No one ever looked twice. The Smith family rarely acknowledged him beyond cursory nods. Vivian Smith, the stern matriarch, treated the staff as extensions of the mansion itself, functional necessities rather than people. Her son Graham occasionally offered a distracted thank you, but his eyes never quite met John's. The janitor didn't mind. He found peace in the simplicity of his work, in keeping things clean when so much else in life remained messy. That night, John was polishing the East Wing corridor, moonlight streaming through tall windows onto the marble floors. The mansion stood silent as a tomb, the family having retired hours ago. He dipped his mop into the bucket, wringing it with practiced hands, the smell of lemon cleaner hanging in the air. His soft humming echoed slightly against the high ceilings, an old tune his grandmother had taught him, long before tragedy had taken his daughter Danielle. Just past midnight, a sound cut through the stillness, high-pitched and desperate. A baby's frantic cry stabbed the quiet like a knife. John dropped his mop, the wooden handle clattering against the floor. He froze for a heartbeat, his mind racing. There were no infants in the Harrington estate, at least none he'd been told about. The cry came again, more urgent this time. Instinct took over. John abandoned his cleaning supplies and moved toward the sound, his heart pounding louder than his footsteps. The wailing seemed to come from somewhere down the hall, perhaps from the unused guest quarters. As he approached, the cries grew more distinct, more desperate. His pace quickened, decades of caution giving way to concern. The principal janitor knew he was crossing an invisible boundary. Staff weren't meant to wander uninvited through private areas of the mansion, especially at night. But something in that cry spoke to the father in him, to the wound that had never fully healed. "Hold on," he whispered to the darkness. "I'm coming." The linen closet door was ajar, a thin wedge of light spilling onto the marble floor of the Harrington estate. John Smith hesitated, his calloused hand frozen on the doorknob. The wailing grew more desperate, a primal, helpless sound that stirred something deep within him. He pushed the door open wider, the hinges protesting with a soft creak. Inside, nestled among press sheets and expensive towels, lay a baby wrapped in a silk shawl. The infant was red-faced and wailing, tiny fists clenched in terror, legs kicking frantically against the confining fabric. The shawl, which John would later learn belonged to Vivian Smith's late husband, was exquisitely embroidered, a stark contrast to the child's distress. "Lord have mercy," he whispered, his heart clenching. Without hesitation, he scooped the child into his arms, cradling the small head against his shoulder with practiced ease. The baby couldn't have been more than 3 months old. "There now, little one," he murmured, his voice a low, soothing rumble. "You're not alone anymore." John began to hum, a lullaby his grandmother had sung to them on hot Mississippi nights when the world seemed too big and frightening. The melody flowed naturally, muscle memory from years ago when he'd comforted his own daughter Danielle. The familiar ache of her absence pressed against his ribs as he swayed gently from side to side. The infant's cries began to soften, hiccuping into whimpers. Tiny fingers unclenched and reached up, brushing against the janitor's face with butterfly gentleness. The baby pressed its cheek to his chest, seeking the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. finding comfort in a warmth that the mansion's marble and money couldn't manufacture. "That's right," John whispered, his weathered thumb wiping away the tear tracks on the baby's flushed cheeks. "You just needed somebody to hear you, didn't you?" In the dim light, he could make out features that stirred recognition, a familiar dimple, the distinctive shape of the eyes. This wasn't just any abandoned child. The janitor's mind raced as he connected pieces of overheard conversations, whispered rumors among the staff, and the strange tension that had filled the house these past months. He looked down at the now quieting infant and realized he was holding a secret that could shatter the carefully constructed facade of the Smith family. The baby's eyes, now blinking sleepily up at him, were unmistakably Graham's. Outside the closet, footsteps echoed down the corridor. Growing closer with each passing second, the door burst open with a bang that echoed through the mansion. 2 security guards in dark uniforms rushed in first, hands hovering near their holsters. Behind them stood Graham Smith, his normally composed face now drained of color. The heir to the Harrington fortune looked as though he'd seen a ghost. His mother, Vivian Smith, followed closely, her spine rigid with authority, lips pressed into a thin line of displeasure. "What is the meaning of this?" Vivian demanded, her voice cutting through the baby's softening cries. The room fell into a sudden, suffocating silence. 5 pairs of eyes locked onto the infant, nestled against John Smith's chest. The janitor stood his ground, one hand protectively cradling the child's head. In that moment, the invisible barriers between staff and family seemed to dissolve under the weight of what everyone could plainly see. The baby turned its face toward the newcomers, and Graham audibly gasped. There, in the infant's features, were his own distinctive eyes, the same unusual shade of hazel, with flecks of gold that had marked Smith men for generations. When the child's face briefly relaxed into contentment, a small dimple appeared on the left cheek, identical to the one Graham unconsciously touched on his own face. That's not possible," Graham whispered, but his trembling voice betrayed that he knew otherwise. Vivian stepped forward, her designer heels clicking ominously on the marble floor. She studied the child with clinical detachment, then shot a venomous glance at her son. "Who brought this situation into my house?" she hissed. John remained silent, his gentle humming now stopped. The security guards exchanged uncomfortable glances, shifting their weight from foot to foot. One of them, the younger one, couldn't stop staring at the unmistakable resemblance between heir and infant. Graham moved closer, drawn by some primal recognition. His fingers reached out tentatively toward the baby, stopping just short of touching the tiny hand. The child instinctively grabbed his finger, and something broke in Graham's carefully maintained facade. "Mother, he began, but words failed him. The truth hung in the air, undeniable and explosive. This was Graham's child, a secret heir, hidden away in a linen closet. The implications rippled through the room like a stone dropped in still water. Rosa Martinez appeared at the doorway, her eyes wide with fear as she took in the tableau. Her gaze met John's briefly, a silent exchange of shared understanding passing between them. The silence stretched, thick with questions no one dared ask aloud. In John's arms, the evidence of a truth the Smith family had tried desperately to bury, gurgled softly, oblivious to how its very existence threatened to topple a dynasty built on carefully curated appearances. Silence. "Not a word of this leaves this room," Vivian Smith hissed, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The matriarch's fingers dug into the silk fabric of her robe as she surveyed the scene with cold calculation. "Everyone here is bound by their employment contracts. Need I remind you of the consequences?" John Smith stood motionless, the weight of the moment pressing down on his shoulders. With gentle hands that had polished countless surfaces in this mansion, he carefully transferred the infant back to Graham. Their eyes met briefly, the janitor's steady gaze meeting the heir's conflicted one. Graham Smith took his son with trembling hands, his carefully constructed facade of indifference crumbling like sand. For a fleeting moment, something raw and vulnerable flashed across his features as he cradled the child against his chest. "Mother, perhaps we should—" Graham began, but Vivian silenced him with a sharp gesture. "Not now," she snapped, turning to the security guards. "Clear the room. And you," she pointed at John, "will report to my office at 9 tomorrow morning." The staff dispersed, casting furtive glances at the janitor, who had stumbled upon the family's most guarded secret. John returned to his duties, the weight of what he'd witnessed settling into his bones. He continued his work methodically, the familiar rhythm of cleaning offering little comfort against the storm he sensed brewing. By morning, whispers traveled through the service corridors like electricity. The kitchen staff fell silent when John entered for his coffee. Rosa Martinez, her eyes wide with unspoken questions, slipped him a note warning that Vivian had been making calls all night. At precisely 8:45, Graham intercepted John near the east wing. The young heir looked haggard, shadows beneath his eyes betraying a sleepless night. "My mother's lawyer has prepared some paperwork," he said quietly. "Non-disclosure agreements. Standard procedure, she says." He paused, struggling with his next words. "There's also compensation being offered. Substantial compensation." John understood immediately. Hush money, his silence purchased like another service. By 9, he sat across from Vivian in her immaculate office as she slid an envelope across the polished mahogany desk. "A bonus," she called it, her voice businesslike. "For your discretion and loyalty to this family." John looked at the envelope, but made no move to take it. "With respect, ma'am, my dignity isn't for sale." Vivian's expression hardened. "Everyone has a price, Mr. Smith." "Not everyone," he replied simply, rising from his chair. "If that's all, I have floors to attend to." As he walked away, John could feel her calculating gaze boring into his back. He knew the battle lines had been drawn and that he had just made a powerful enemy. John Smith was wiping down the last of the service corridor windows when he heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he found Graham Smith standing awkwardly in the hallway, his normally composed demeanor replaced by something more vulnerable. The heir to the Harrington estate looked like he hadn't slept, his eyes rimmed with red. "Could we talk?" Graham asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Somewhere private?" John nodded, leading him to a small alcove where staff sometimes took breaks. The janitor waited patiently as the younger man struggled to find words. "That baby," Graham finally began, his voice trembling. "He's my son." The confession hung in the air between them. John remained silent, giving Graham space to continue. "I met Maya Johnson at a charity function last year," he explained. "She was covering the event for her newspaper. We connected immediately, but Mother—" He shook his head. "Mother would never approve of a journalist in the family. We kept everything secret." John thought of the infant's features, those unmistakable dimples that mirrored Graham's own. "Maya disappeared 8 months ago," Graham continued, running his hands through his disheveled hair. "Everyone told me she'd abandoned me, that she couldn't handle the pressure of our relationship. I believed them." "But now you're not so sure," John observed quietly. Graham's eyes met his. "How did my son end up hidden in a linen closet in my own home? And where's Maya?" The questions lingered in the stale corridor air. John remembered how Vivian Smith had reacted to the discovery, not with surprise, but with calculated fury. The matriarch's controlled rage suggested knowledge, not shock. "I loved her," Graham whispered, his composure cracking, "and I never even knew she was pregnant." John's mind raced through possibilities, none of them pleasant. His instincts, honed by years of observing the family while remaining invisible to them, prickled with unease. Something was deeply wrong in this mansion of marble and secrets. "Your mother seemed very prepared with those security guards and legal papers," John said carefully. Graham's face paled. I've been wondering the same thing. Maya wouldn't just leave, and she certainly wouldn't abandon our child. John thought of his own daughter, lost years ago, the pain that never truly healed. What will you do now? He asked. Graham straightened his shoulders, a flash of determination breaking through his distress. Find the truth, whatever it costs me. As they parted ways, John felt the weight of this confidence settle on his shoulders. The janitor, who had always stayed in the shadows, now found himself stepping reluctantly into the light of a family drama that grew darker by the hour. John Smith had been dusting the shelves in the archives for over an hour, his methodical movements matching the rhythm of the old spiritual he hummed under his breath. The basement room smelled of leather-bound ledgers and the faint mustiness that money couldn't quite eliminate. Most staff avoided this forgotten corner of the Harrington estate, but John found peace among the silent witnesses to the family's history. His cloth passed over a stack of unlabeled discs when one slipped, clattering to the floor. The janitor bent to retrieve it, noticing the hastily scrawled date, 8 months ago, just days before Maya Johnson's disappearance. His heart quickened as he glanced toward the door. The security office was empty when John slipped inside. He inserted the disc with trembling fingers, the blue glow of the monitor illuminating his weathered face. The footage showed the service entrance at dusk. Then she appeared, Maya, her journalist notebook clutched to her chest, glancing nervously over her shoulder as Graham ushered her inside. John leaned closer. The timestamp matched the night Graham had supposedly been out of town. He watched as the couple argued in the corridor, Maya's hands moving animatedly while Graham kept looking toward his mother's wing. When Vivian suddenly appeared at the far end of the hall, Graham quickly guided Maya into a side room. The janitor's breath caught as he watched Vivian Smith pause, her imperious gaze sweeping the corridor before she continued on her way. The camera angle shifted, showing Maya leaving 2 hours later, wiping tears from her face. Graham didn't escort her out. 3 days after this footage, Maya had vanished without a trace. John ejected the disc, slipping it into his pocket. The weight of it seemed to press against his chest, heavier than any mop or bucket he'd carried through these halls. He'd seen the way Vivian looked at the baby, not with a grandmother's love, but with calculation, as if measuring a threat. Back in his quarters, he wrapped the disc in a clean handkerchief and tucked it beneath a loose floorboard. In his 5 years at the estate, John had learned which secrets to keep and which to expose. This one felt dangerous, like holding a match in a room full of gasoline. Trust had always been a luxury in this house. The staff knew their place, their eyes trained to look down, not up. But now, as John settled onto his narrow bed, he realized that trust could be more dangerous than betrayal when the powerful had something to hide. And the Smiths had buried their secrets deeper than most. John Smith was trimming the rose bushes when he noticed Rosa Martinez approaching. The young maid's shoulders were hunched, her steps hesitant as she made her way across the immaculate lawn. Her eyes, usually downcast when passing the senior staff, now sought him out with desperate intensity. "Mr. Smith," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Can I speak with you, please?" John set down his gardening shears and nodded, guiding her to a stone bench partially hidden by a weeping willow. Rosa's hands trembled in her lap as tears began streaming down her face. "It was me," she confessed, her words tumbling out between sobs. "I was the one caring for the baby. Mrs. Smith ordered me to keep him hidden, threatened my job, my visa, everything." The janitor listened silently, his weathered face betraying no judgment. Rosa explained how Vivian had assigned her to secret night shifts, caring for the infant away from prying eyes. The arrangement had worked until last night, when the pressure became too much. "I've been having panic attacks since my father died last year," she admitted, wiping her tears with her uniform sleeve. "Last night was the worst one. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I left him in the linen closet for what was supposed to be just a minute. But then..." Her voice cracked completely. "I'm so sorry. I never meant to put him in danger." John placed his calloused hand gently on her shoulder. "You're carrying too much alone, child." Rosa looked up, surprised by his kindness rather than condemnation. "They'll fire me if they find out I told you. I need this job to help my family back home." "Some burdens aren't meant to be carried alone," John said softly. "I promise you, Rosa, I won't let them hurt you for this." Something in his tone made her study his face more carefully. The maid noticed the deep lines around his eyes, the way his gaze sometimes drifted to somewhere far beyond the estate's manicured grounds. "You understand, don't you?" she whispered. "You've lost someone too." John nodded, his thoughts briefly turning to Danielle. The pain had dulled over the years, but never truly disappeared. In Rosa's struggle, he recognized his own past wounds, the helplessness, the guilt, the desperate need for someone to simply understand. "We'll figure this out together," he promised, his voice firm despite its gentleness. "That baby deserves better, and so do you." For the first time in weeks, Rosa's breathing steadied. In the quiet sanctuary of the garden, surrounded by flowers that would never judge, she'd found an unexpected ally in the mansion's most overlooked employee. Graham Smith found himself lingering in the kitchen long after midnight, waiting for the familiar sound of John's quiet footsteps. These late-night meetings had become his sanctuary, the only moments when he could speak freely without his mother's shadow looming over him. "He smiled today," Graham whispered when John appeared, his voice soft with wonder. "My son actually smiled at me." John nodded, setting down his thermos of coffee. The kitchen's dim light softened the lines on his weathered face as he pulled up a chair. These conversations had started with awkward silences, but had evolved into something neither man had expected: genuine connection. "Children know more than we think," John replied. "They sense who truly cares for them." Graham ran his fingers through his disheveled hair. "I never thought I'd be sneaking around my own home to see my child. Mother has everyone convinced this is all for the best, keeping him hidden until she can manage the situation." His voice cracked slightly. "I should stand up to her, but—" "Fear is a powerful thing," John said, understanding in his eyes. "It took me years to face mine." As their midnight talks continued, Graham revealed dreams he'd never shared with anyone, his secret children's stories, his hopes of building a life with Maya, his desire to break free from the suffocating expectations that had defined his existence. "I wanted to teach literature, you know," Graham confessed one night. "Before Mother decided I would run the family business." John listened without judgment, offering wisdom born from his own pain. He rarely spoke of Danielle, but her presence lingered in the gentle way he handled the baby, in the lullabies he hummed while working. "Sometimes I see her in my dreams," John admitted during their fourth late-night meeting. "My daughter. She's always smiling, telling me it's okay." His eyes grew distant. "But it's never really okay, is it?" Graham reached across the table, a gesture that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier, and briefly touched the older man's arm. The mansion that had once seemed so vast now felt like it was closing in around them. Every corridor held whispers, every shadow a potential spy for Vivian. John found himself checking over his shoulder more frequently, feeling the weight of secrets pressing against his chest. "We can't keep this hidden forever," John said one evening as they heard Vivian's footsteps in the hallway above. "Sooner or later, truth finds its way out." Graham nodded slowly, his face a battlefield of fear and resolve. "When it does," he whispered, "I need to be ready to choose the right side." Vivian Smith paced her study, a crystal tumbler of whiskey clutched in her manicured hand. "That child is not my grandson," she insisted to the family lawyer on her smartphone. "Graham was manipulated by that journalist." She spat the last word like poison. John Smith paused outside the door, dustcloth in hand. He'd learned long ago that invisibility was both his shield and his window into truth. The janitor pressed closer to the mahogany panels, his breath shallow. I don't care what it costs, Vivian continued, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Find something, anything in Maya Johnson's past. Mental health issues, financial problems, a parking ticket, for God's sake. We need leverage to have her declared unfit. The matriarch fell silent, listening to the response. John's heart hammered against his ribs. He'd known Vivian was ruthless, but this calculated destruction of a mother's life chilled him to the bone. Once we have custody, she continued, we'll place the child with a suitable family overseas. Graham will forget this nonsense eventually. She laughed, a brittle sound devoid of warmth. He always does what's expected in the end. John stepped back, careful not to make the floorboards creak. The web of deception ran deeper than he'd imagined. This wasn't just about hiding an embarrassing scandal. Vivian was orchestrating the complete erasure of Maya and her child from Graham's life. He retreated down the corridor, mind racing. In the service stairwell, he leaned against the wall, suddenly understanding the full scope of what he'd stumbled into. The baby wasn't just an inconvenience to the Smith legacy. He was a threat to Vivian's absolute control over her son and the family fortune. That night, John couldn't sleep. Images of his own daughter haunted him. How helpless he'd felt when he couldn't protect her. The memory of the infant's tiny fingers wrapping around his thumb burned in his mind. He couldn't stand by and watch another innocent life destroyed by wealth and power. Morning found him in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee when Rosa Martinez entered. The young maid looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes betraying her sleepless nights. She's having me pack the nursery items, Rosa whispered, glancing nervously at the door. Says they're being donated. John nodded slowly. We don't have much time, he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. Whatever Vivian's planning, she won't wait long. Rosa's eyes widened with understanding. In that moment, an unspoken pact formed between them, two invisible people standing against a fortress of privilege and lies. Rosa Martinez approached John Smith with trembling hands, clutching a yellowed photograph she'd discovered while cleaning the dusty corners of the mansion's attic. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and revelation. John, I found something you need to see, she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. The janitor took the photograph, and his breath caught in his throat. There he was, a decade younger, standing outside Memorial General Hospital, his face etched with grief. In his arms, he held a small bouquet of wildflowers. That day was burned into his memory, the day he said goodbye to Danielle. Where did you find this? John asked, his voice barely audible. Rosa explained how she'd been organizing old boxes in the attic when she stumbled upon a file labeled Legal Settlements. Inside were dozens of photographs, medical records, and confidential agreements. There were notes about your daughter, she said, and the clinic's name. It was owned by the Smiths, John, the same family. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. Danielle had died at 23 from what the hospital called unavoidable complications. But John had always suspected negligence. He'd fought for answers, filed complaints, but eventually hit walls too high to climb. Now he understood why. The private clinic had been part of Vivian Smith's healthcare empire, quietly settled out of court with families too poor or exhausted to fight further. John sank onto a wooden crate, memories flooding back. His daughter's laugh, her dreams of becoming a teacher, the way she'd called him every Sunday without fail. All stolen because corners were cut to save money. They knew, he whispered. All this time, they knew who I was when they hired me. Rosa placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Maybe that's why Vivian always watches you so closely. The pieces aligned with terrible clarity. His application had been fast-tracked 5 years ago, despite dozens of more qualified candidates. Vivian had personally approved his hiring. Was it guilt? Or was it to keep him close, to monitor the father who might still seek justice? The baby's cry echoed from somewhere in the mansion, pulling John back to the present. His hands stopped shaking as determination replaced shock. The child upstairs, Graham and Maya's innocent son, deserved better than to be another casualty of this family's ruthless preservation of power and wealth. "I couldn't save Danielle," John said, carefully tucking the photograph into his pocket, "but I won't let them hurt another child, not this time." Rosa nodded, her own resolve strengthening alongside his. "We'll protect him, John, together." The janitor stood, straightening his uniform with newfound purpose. The Smiths had taken his daughter. They would not take this child too. John Smith's fingers trembled as he held the small, ragged corner of silk. The delicate fabric, frayed at the edges, had been tucked behind a loose panel in the small utility room adjacent to the kitchen. He had noticed it only because of the slight discoloration on the wall, the kind of detail only a janitor of 5 years would catch. The pattern was unmistakable, pale blue with silver embroidery that caught the light just so. He had seen this material before, wrapped around the infant when he first discovered him crying in the linen closet. But this torn piece told a deeper story. 3 days earlier, while polishing the antique side tables in Vivian's private sitting room, John had glimpsed something hastily tucked into a small drawer. The matriarch had been called away unexpectedly, leaving the drawer partially open. Inside lay another piece of the same fabric, larger, but with a jagged edge where it had been torn. "Mr. Harold's wedding shawl," Rosa had whispered when John carefully showed her his discovery. Her eyes had widened with recognition. "Vivian keeps it locked away. It belonged to her husband, a family heirloom he carried from Scotland. She never lets anyone touch it." John carefully placed the fragment in a small envelope and tucked it inside the lining of his work boots. The evidence was mounting, piece by piece. The security footage of Maya's last visit, the photograph from the hospital, and now this, the late patriarch's treasured cloth, deliberately torn and used to wrap his grandson. Every whisper in the corridors, every hastily ended conversation when he entered a room, they were all threads in a tapestry of deception. The Smiths had built their fortress on silence, but even the strongest walls had cracks. That evening, John slipped into the garden shed and retrieved the metal box he'd hidden beneath the floorboards. Inside lay his growing collection: photographs, notes of conversations overheard, dates and times meticulously recorded. He added the fabric sample, carefully labeled. As he walked back toward the staff quarters, he passed Graham in the hallway. The air nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement between two men bound by an unspoken truth. John returned the gesture, his face revealing nothing. The janitor knew what it meant to lose a child. He wouldn't let it happen again, not to Maya, not to Graham, and certainly not to the innocent baby who deserved more than to be a secret buried in silk and lies. "The truth finds its way to light," his grandmother used to say. John was simply clearing the path. "I need to tell you something," Rosa Martinez whispered, her hands trembling as she closed the door to the small utility room where she and John often spoke in private. The young maid's eyes darted nervously to the corridor, checking for shadows or footsteps. John Smith set aside the cleaning supplies he'd been organizing and gave her his full attention. Something in her voice told him this wasn't about the baby or another of Vivian's schemes. "Maya Johnson isn't just someone I read about in the news," Rosa continued, her voice barely audible. "She's my cousin. We grew up together in the same neighborhood. When she disappeared, my family was devastated." John's eyes widened as the pieces clicked into place. Rosa's intense interest in the baby, her willingness to risk her job by helping him, the haunted look whenever Maya's name was mentioned. "I applied for this job 6 months ago when I heard rumors about Graham's connection to her," she explained. "I needed to find out what happened. My aunt, Maya's mother, is sick with worry. She doesn't believe Maya would just abandon her life, her work, or her baby." "That's why you were caring for the child," John said softly, understanding blooming in his weathered face. "You recognized your own blood." Rosa nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "The first time I saw him, I knew. He has Maya's chin, her expressions. I couldn't leave him alone in this cold place." John reached out, his calloused hand covering her smaller one. He thought of his own daughter, of the helplessness he'd felt when he couldn't save her. This young woman had infiltrated one of the wealthiest, most powerful families in the country, armed with nothing but determination and love. "You're braver than you know," he told her, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm terrified every day," Rosa admitted. "But what choice do I have? Family is family." John nodded, understanding the weight of those simple words. "We'll find her, Rosa. Whatever Vivian has done, wherever Maya is, we'll bring her home." "They'll destroy us if they discover what we're doing," she whispered. "Then we'll be careful," John replied, a quiet strength in his voice. "I've been invisible in this house for years. Now we'll use that to our advantage." In that moment, an unspoken pact formed between them. The janitor who had lost everything, and the maid who risked everything. Two unlikely guardians standing against wealth and power, armed only with truth and conviction. "Together," Rosa said, straightening her shoulders. "Together," John echoed, his resolve hardening like steel. John Smith's hands trembled as he spread the documents across his small table in the staff quarters. The pieces were finally coming together, revealing a truth far more sinister than he'd imagined. Maya Johnson hadn't abandoned Graham and their child as everyone believed. The journalist had been systematically erased from their lives. "Look at the signature," Rosa Martinez whispered, pointing to the medical assessment declaring Maya mentally unstable. "Dr. Winters has been the Smith family physician for 20 years. He'd sign anything Vivian asked." The janitor nodded grimly. The paperwork was meticulous. Fabricated psychiatric evaluations, emergency commitment forms, and transfer orders to a private facility called Lakeview Wellness Center. All bearing the unmistakable flourish of Vivian Smith's influence. "My cousin was investigating the Smith family's business practices," Rosa explained, her voice breaking. "She told me she found something big, but before she could publish." The young maid wiped away tears with the back of her hand. John placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "That's why you took this job." "I needed to know what happened to her," she confessed. "I never imagined they'd go this far." Together they examined a visitor log Rosa had managed to photograph during a delivery to Vivian's study. Maya's name appeared with a red line through it, followed by an address John didn't recognize. A quick search on his phone revealed Lakeview was no ordinary wellness center, but a secluded facility known for its discretion and limited family access. "She's been there for 8 months, John murmured, calculating the timeline, while her baby grew up without her. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Vivian hadn't just separated a mother from her child. She'd orchestrated an elaborate scheme to erase Maya completely, likely hoping to gain control of her grandchild. The same ruthless efficiency that built the Smith fortune had been turned against an innocent woman. "Graham doesn't know," Rosa said. "He thinks she abandoned them both." John's mind flashed to his own daughter, to the hospital owned by the Smith family where she had died due to negligence. The pattern was clear now. Lives deemed inconvenient to the Smith legacy simply disappeared or were rewritten. "Vivian's reach goes beyond money," John said, his voice hardening with resolve. "She's playing God with people's lives." He carefully gathered the evidence, securing it in a waterproof pouch. The conspiracy was larger and more calculated than he'd suspected. But now they had proof, and with it, the power to bring light to Maya's darkness. "We need to move carefully," John told Rosa. "Vivian won't give up her control easily." Thomas Wilson, the elderly groundskeeper who had tended the Harrington Estate Gardens for over 20 years, had always admired John Smith from afar. While other staff members kept their distance from the janitor, Thomas recognized the quiet dignity in the man's eyes, a reflection of his own life philosophy. On the night John rescued the baby, Thomas had been checking the greenhouse heaters. Through the conservatory windows, he witnessed the entire scene unfold. John's gentle rescue, the confrontation with Vivian Smith and the security guards, and the unmistakable resemblance between the infant and Graham. Without hesitation, Thomas pulled out his smartphone and recorded everything. "Some things need witnessing," he muttered to himself as his arthritic fingers pressed the record button. For days, the groundskeeper debated what to do with the footage. He watched Vivian's increasing control over the household, saw John's quiet resistance, and noted Rosa Martinez's tearful trips to the garden bench when she thought no one was looking. The weight of what he knew pressed heavily on his conscience. One evening, after creating an anonymous account at the public library, Thomas uploaded the video. He titled it simply, "The Janitor Who Heard What Money Ignored." Within hours, the clip spread across social media platforms like wildfire. The video showed everything: John's tenderness with the child, the unmistakable family resemblance, and most damning of all, Vivian's cold calculation as she ordered silence. Viewers were captivated by the contrast between John's humanity and the family's rigid control. By morning, news vans lined the estate's perimeter. Reporters shouted questions at anyone entering or leaving the property. Hashtags trended globally, with "Justice for the Janitor" and "Smith Family Secrets" dominating conversations online. Inside the mansion, panic erupted. Vivian summoned her crisis management team while Graham paced the library, alternating between rage at the exposure and relief that the truth might finally emerge. Security guards patrolled the grounds, searching for the source of the leak. John continued his work, mopping floors and emptying trash as if nothing had changed. But he noticed how staff members now looked at him differently, some with newfound respect, others with fear of association. Rosa squeezed his hand briefly when they passed in the hallway, a silent acknowledgement of the shifting tides. That evening, as John left through the service entrance, a journalist called out to him. "Are you the janitor from the video? The one who saved the baby?" He paused, considering his response carefully. The truth had been set free, and there was no containing it now. The walls of secrecy that had protected the Smith family for generations were crumbling under the weight of public outrage and moral clarity. The soft glow of the nightlight cast gentle shadows across the nursery walls. John Smith sat in the old rocking chair, cradling Graham and Maya's son against his chest. The mansion had grown quiet, with most of the staff retired for the evening. Only the occasional creak of the wooden floors betrayed Rosa's vigilant presence nearby. The janitor hummed softly, his calloused fingers gently stroking the baby's back. The tune started as something formless, then gradually took shape, a melody he hadn't allowed himself to sing in years. It was the lullaby he'd composed for Danielle, his daughter who had slipped away at the private clinic owned by the Smith family. Each note carried the weight of memory, of loss transformed into something tender. "My little star, shine bright and true," John sang, his voice barely above a whisper. "The night is dark, but I'm here with you." The baby, usually restless at this hour, grew still in his arms. Tiny fingers reached up to touch John's face, exploring the gentle creases around his eyes. Then, to the janitor's surprise, the child began to clap, awkward, uncoordinated movements that nonetheless kept perfect time with the melody. A soft laugh bubbled from the infant's lips, bright and clear in the quiet room. Then, as John reached the final verse, the baby's mouth formed a perfect O before uttering a single, unmistakable word: "Papa." The rocking chair stopped abruptly. Rosa gasped from the doorway where she'd been standing. Graham, who had entered silently moments before, froze with his hand still on the doorknob. The word hung in the air between them, a simple syllable that carried the weight of everything unspoken in this house of secrets. Everyone stared at John, the implications clear in their wide eyes and parted lips. John looked down at the child, his expression gentle but resolute. He shook his head slowly and whispered, "No, son, that's not for me." He stood carefully, crossing the room to where Graham stood motionless. That word belongs to your father." As he placed the baby in Graham's trembling arms, their eyes met, the heir and the janitor, connected by something deeper than the mansion's hierarchy could ever define. "He knows your voice," John said softly, "even when you think he doesn't hear you reading those books at night." Graham's eyes glistened in the dim light as he held his son closer. Rosa slipped quietly from the doorway, leaving father and son alone with the janitor who had become, against all odds, the keeper of their most precious truths. John Smith was dusting the nursery shelves when he noticed the small, well-worn book tucked between the baby's blankets. Curiosity piqued, he gently lifted it from the crib. The cover featured hand-drawn illustrations of a journalist adventuring through magical forests with a small child. The author's name, G.H. Nightingale, meant nothing to him, but something about the style felt oddly familiar. That evening, while polishing the hallway outside Graham Smith's study, John overheard the heir on a phone call. "No, I can't publish another one right now," Graham whispered urgently. "Nightingale needs to stay anonymous, especially with everything happening." The pieces clicked together in John's mind. He waited until Graham ended his call before knocking softly. "Mr. Smith, I found this in the nursery," John said, holding out the book. Graham's face drained of color. "Where did you get that?" "It was in your son's crib. The pages are quite worn." John handed it over carefully. "You're G.H. Nightingale, aren't you?" The younger man slumped into his chair, running his fingers over the book's cover. "Maya always said I should write down my stories." His voice cracked slightly. "She was the only one who knew. She believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself." John observed the tenderness with which Graham held the book, like a precious artifact from a happier time. "I started writing these when Maya told me she was pregnant," Graham continued. "I wanted our child to have something real from me, something my mother couldn't control or take away." The janitor nodded, understanding the weight of this confession. "Your son responds to them. I've seen his eyes light up when Rosa reads to him." Graham smiled faintly. "I sneak in at night sometimes, just to read to him. It's the only time I feel—" He trailed off, searching for words. "Like a father?" John offered gently. "Like myself," Graham corrected. "My father never read to me, never held me. Vivian made sure our relationship was proper, distant, all about legacy, never about love." John thought about his own daughter, how he'd sung to her every night, how precious those moments had been. "Your son deserves the father you never had," John said quietly. "And you deserve to be that father." Graham's eyes glistened. "These books are the only honest part of me. Everything else is just performance." "Not everything," John replied. "Not anymore." As he left the study, John realized that in this mansion built on appearances, Graham's secret books represented perhaps the only authentic truth, a father's love finding its way through the cracks of a broken legacy. Vivian Smith's schemes had evolved from quiet manipulation to outright forgery. In her private study, with the curtains drawn and doors locked, she finalized what she considered her masterpiece, a death certificate bearing the infant's name. The document, complete with official seals and signatures from doctors on her payroll, declared that Graham's son had died of natural causes shortly after birth. John Smith discovered this while emptying the waste bin in her office. A crumpled draft of the certificate had missed the shredder, and his blood ran cold as he smoothed out the paper. The janitor's hands trembled as he realized the depth of the matriarch's deception. She wasn't just hiding the child, she was erasing his very existence. "With this, Maya will have no legal claim," he overheard Vivian telling her attorney over the phone later that evening. "We'll keep the heir secure until I can properly place him with a suitable family, one that understands discretion and loyalty." The janitor had been methodically collecting evidence for weeks: photographs of the baby in the mansion, recordings of conversations, copies of staff schedules showing Rosa Martinez's secret assignments to care for the child, and even the torn piece of silk shawl that connected Vivian directly to the infant. Each item was carefully documented and stored in a waterproof container buried beneath a loose stone in the garden, the one place he knew security cameras didn't reach. Rosa found him there one evening, her eyes wide with fear. "She's planning to move him tomorrow," she whispered. "I heard her telling Graham that the baby needs special medical attention at a private facility." John nodded grimly. The same kind of attention Maya received, no doubt. That night, alone in his small quarters, John faced the most difficult decision of his life. Coming forward meant losing his job, facing potential lawsuits, and possibly endangering Rosa. Staying silent meant condemning an innocent child and his mother to separation, perhaps forever. He thought of his daughter Danielle, of the justice she never received. He thought of Graham's quiet desperation and Maya's stolen voice. Most of all, he thought of the baby, whose tiny fingers had once wrapped around his thumb with complete trust. "Some prices are worth paying," he murmured to himself, carefully organizing his evidence into a folder. The risk was immense, but his conscience refused to let him back down. By morning, John had made his choice. The truth would come out, whatever the cost to him. He placed a call to a number Rosa had given him, Maya's attorney, who had been searching for her for months. With Rosa Martinez's trembling hands beside his steady ones, John Smith compiled the final evidence package. Photographs of the torn silk shawl, copies of the forged death certificate, and the security footage showing Maya's last visit to the estate, all meticulously labeled and organized. The maid had risked everything to help him, her loyalty to her cousin Maya outweighing her fear of Vivian. "Are you sure about this?" Rosa whispered, her voice barely audible in the small room they'd claimed as their war room. "They'll come after us both." John nodded, his weathered face resolute. Some things are worth losing everything for. The state investigator's eyes widened as she reviewed their evidence. Within 48 hours, a formal investigation was launched, and the Harrington estate found itself under siege, not by force, but by truth. Vivian's retaliation was swift and merciless. The family's army of attorneys descended upon John with cease and desist orders, defamation threats, and employment termination papers. The matriarch herself cornered him in an empty corridor, her voice ice-cold as she promised to destroy not just his livelihood, but any chance of future employment. "You're nothing," she hissed, perfectly manicured finger jabbing toward his chest. "A janitor who forgot his place." John stood tall, unflinching. "My place has always been on the side of what's right, ma'am." Graham found John packing his few belongings that evening. The air looked haggard, torn between family loyalty and the growing certainty that John was fighting for his son's future. "I can't openly support you," Graham admitted, shame coloring his words. "Not yet, but I've hired you legal counsel, the best." The courthouse steps swarmed with reporters when the case opened. John walked through them with dignity, Rosa a half step behind. Inside, Vivian's legal team painted John as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, Rosa as an accomplice motivated by greed. But evidence speaks louder than expensive lawyers. When the security footage played, showing Maya's desperate attempt to see Graham before her treatment, the courtroom fell silent. When the forged medical records were compared with expert testimony, gasps echoed through the gallery. John testified for 6 grueling hours, his voice never wavering as he described finding the baby, the conspiracy to hide his existence, and the systematic attempt to erase Maya from the narrative. "I'm not here for money or fame," he told the judge, his words carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "I'm here because somewhere in that mansion is a child who deserves to know his mother, and a mother who deserves to know her child still lives." The first day of testimony ended. John walked out alone into the fading light, carrying nothing but the certainty that right was right, no matter the cost. The courtroom fell silent as Graham Smith rose from his seat. His shoulders, usually bent under the weight of his mother's expectations, were straight now. The judge gestured for him to approach the witness stand. As he walked past the gallery, his eyes met John's, a fleeting moment of solidarity before he faced the court. "Mr. Smith, please tell us in your own words what happened the night your son was discovered," the prosecutor said. Graham's voice, steady and clear, filled the hushed room. "My mother orchestrated everything. The baby, my son with Maya Johnson, was hidden away because she couldn't bear the scandal. If not for John Smith, I might never have found the courage to stand up for my child." From her seat beside her attorneys, Vivian's face hardened into stone. The matriarch's carefully constructed world was crumbling under oath. Each word from her son's lips, another brick falling away. "John is the reason my son is alive," Graham continued, emotion finally breaking through his composed exterior. "Not just physically, but in spirit. He protected him when I was too afraid to defy my mother. He kept his humanity in a house where money mattered more than morality." The judge leaned forward, her gaze moving between Graham and the elderly janitor sitting quietly in the back row. John's weathered hands rested on his knees, his expression humble yet unwavering. When Maya was brought to testify, her reunion with Graham across the courtroom spoke volumes. The journalist's strength had not diminished during her wrongful confinement. The evidence John and Rosa had meticulously gathered, the security footage, forged medical records, and witness testimonies formed an irrefutable case. After 3 grueling days, the verdict came down. The judge awarded joint custody to Maya and Graham, with strict limitations on Vivian's access to the child. The family's private facility where Maya had been held would face separate criminal charges. Outside the courthouse, Vivian approached John with her final blow. "You're terminated. No pension, no references," she hissed. "You'll regret choosing sides." John simply nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. "I've lived on less, Mrs. Smith," he said, his dignity intact, "but not for less." Rosa stood nearby, tears streaming down her face as she watched her cousin embrace her son for the first time in months. The maid's courage had helped bring truth to light. Graham approached John, extending his hand. "I don't know how to thank you." "Live honestly," John replied. "That's thanks enough." 1 year had passed since the truth had shattered the Harrington estate's foundations. The mansion stood transformed, its cold marble now warmed by sunlight streaming through newly opened windows. Where silence once suffocated, children's laughter echoed through corridors that had witnessed so much pain. Graham Smith sat on a colorful blanket spread across the lawn, his arm around Maya Johnson as they read to their son from a leather-bound picture book. The toddler squealed with delight at each page turn, his tiny fingers tracing the illustrations his father had lovingly created during those dark days of separation. On the final page was the sheet music for John's lullaby, the melody that had first connected them all. "Your daddy wrote this story just for you," Maya whispered, kissing her son's forehead. Her recovery from the trauma of forced institutionalization had been slow but steady, strengthened by the justice they'd finally received and the family they'd rebuilt. The estate's staff moved freely now, no longer shadows against the walls, but valued members of a community healing together. Rosa Martinez had been promoted to household manager, her quiet competence and unwavering loyalty recognized at last. She passed by the family on the lawn, exchanging a warm smile with her cousin before continuing her rounds. Vivian had retreated to a smaller property across the country, her power diminished but her bitterness intact. The matriarch's absence had allowed the mansion to breathe, to become a home rather than a fortress guarding secrets. In a public garden just 2 miles away, John Smith tended to a bed of sunflowers, his weathered hands gentle among the blooms. Though he'd lost his pension, he'd found purpose in this peaceful place where families gathered and children played without the weight of wealth or status. Hearing the patter of familiar footsteps, John turned to see Graham's son racing toward him, arms outstretched and face alight with joy. "Papa John," the boy called out, a name given in love rather than confusion. John knelt, his knees protesting but his heart soaring as the child crashed into his embrace. He hummed the old spiritual, the melody that had once been his private comfort during lonely nights of grief for Danielle. Now it belonged to all of them, a thread connecting past and future, loss and hope. Graham and Maya approached slowly, giving them their moment. The journalist reached for her partner's hand, squeezing it gently as they watched the bond between the elderly gardener and their son, a relationship that defied explanation yet felt more natural than anything in their privileged world. "This time," Maya said softly, "the world is listening."